Salvis' Search for the Universe. Chapter 15.
Let Salvi go!
She rattled the bars.
Salvi do nothing wrong!
She banged and kicked and raised an absolute racket, trying over and over to tear the iron bars from the walls, never convinced at how woefully impossible it was.
Let Salvi out!
She screamed, again and again, with a tantrum-like simplicity. The warden cupped his ears, his face twisted with enough restraint to make saints seem rash and impulsive, until, finally, "Shut up!" he roared, and stood up with such force it sent the chair into the wall, and, surprisingly, Salvi did shut up.
If you're so innocent, then explain the bleeding letter we got from Lord Farrell's himself, ordering the capture of a kobold, matching your exact description. Huh?
That other kobold, Salvi do nothing wrong!
She started up again, banging and banging, and shouting and banging, on and on and on. The warden gripped his head. The only thing that kept him from stepping in there and putting his truncheon to good use was the slim possibility that Lord Farrell's wanted the creature unharmed for some ungodly reason. Maybe it was his pet, the poor bastard. It was bad enough he had to stay up all night watching it, but being forced to listen to it was its own circle of hell just for him. That it would be out of his hair within a day was a gift from God, and without that singular grace it would have been just about all he could do to keep himself from putting the creature out of his misery. He found his stool, righted it, and sat down. Perhaps if he pretended to be asleep, it would finally give up. As if anything animate or inanimate could catch any sleep with the terrible racket. He closed his eyes and tried anyway. Egerton swirled his wine and dragged it down. The wine of this country was so dreadful. He could hardly believe they were from the same plant. He much preferred the wine from home. He was not so short-sighted as to travel to another country without bringing his own casks. But why was he drinking it now? No, his shortcoming was not lack of foresight, but underestimation. He had not anticipated his stay would be so long and passive. The sheer boredom was what drained his stores more than anything. Of course, he was a man of action, and had sent one of his servants off to fetch another wagon load of the stuff. As soon as it became apparent he would run dry. But, as he was all too well aware of, travelling from one country to another took a dreadful amount of time. So here he was, making do with the local stuff. He contemplated the flavor. If everything went as planned, would he need to grow a taste for this liquid filth? Now, there was a thought. It took him only a moment to decide. Absolutely not. But he drank regardless. His drinking was interrupted by one of his servants. The twiggy man bowed as he ushered in a visitor. He had not been expecting the visitor, but he was not surprised to see them, for no one enters the lair without his awareness.
Impatient, are we?
He smirked.
Curses be on your mother, you perfidious bastard! You know full well why I'm here.
The visitor stormed in and slammed both hands against Egerton's desk.
No, I'm afraid not. Enlighten me. Why? And I must stress myself, why is it I hear that Eowyn's half of the pendant is missing? It was supposed to be delivered at my feet days ago. Instead, it is in the hands of a kobold of all things. That was not information I had searched for. No. Every soldier from here to Lycrest has heard. Yes, it's quite unfortunate, isn't it?
He traced the rim of his goblet idly. The visitor slapped it from his hands, splashing it onto the wall, scowling fiercely. Egerton looked at him placidly.
You are fortunate not only for the coin you put into my hand, but for the quality of that wine. Or you may have found it my hand putting a knife into your gut instead.
He spoke with a queer, jovial tone, far more intimidating than if he had merely shouted. The visitor was unfazed.
You forget yourself, Egerton. This world has little care for you. You slink out of sight like a rat in a sewer, yet the world goes on without you. If you were to kill me here, it would throw my realm into chaos. Thousands would mourn my passing. Who would mourn you? No, you are not like me. You serve men like me.
Egerton cocked a smile.
I am well aware of my station, Duke Rondo. Is that not why I accepted your offer to begin with? Are you not grateful to receive such an offer? Yes, you could say that. Yes. Then you would do well to act like it.
He bared his teeth. Egerton raised his hands in mock surrender.
Perhaps you're right, friend. Come, sit down and share some of this liquid filth you pass off as wine.
He pulled out 2 metal cups from a drawer and filled them both. Rondo sat down and drank the wine without hesitation.
Now that the pleasantry is out of the way, care to explain yourself? Explanations are unnecessary. The mistake was from a mere miscalculation by a subordinate of mine. We are already in the process of rectifying it. You needn't have come here. Any of our messengers would have sufficed.
Messengers.
He sneered.
For this kind of failure, I need to hear it from your mouth. I will not repeat myself again. Explain yourself.
The cup crumbled in Egerton's hand.
Explain myself. Explain myself.
He tittered and calmed himself with measured breaths.
Rondo, we live in the real world in case you haven't forgotten. And in this real world, accidents happen. Recall our first meeting? Did I promise perfection? You promised unmitigated success. Success! Yes, but not perfection. But it's no matter. Admittedly, I expected nothing short of perfection myself. But again, these stumbles do happen from time to time. Try not to worry your lofty head over such trivial matters. We are the best. If you cannot trust us to assure your success, then who could you trust? Perhaps the one who stole it from you,
he said flatly. Something snapped inside Egerton. His jaw clenched under the strain of forcing back his murderous impulses.
Rondo, it is an excellent deal you bring me. But if you speak like that to me again, I will kill you, bastard. Heh, you'll not kill me. I can see the hunger in your eyes. And I do not believe you the type to destroy such a deal in a fit of fertile rage. You will have your kingdom, but call me a bastard again, and you will see how quickly it falls from under you.
Egerton's sawing grip clutched the cup until it resembled the core of an apple someone had eaten, then smiled. Perhaps this bone best left picked another time. Indeed, my back yearns for a throne to rest against, and my head a ceiling not of stone and dirt. Naturally, your success is my utmost concern. Already my men are pursuing the kobold, and it's only a matter of time before the pendant is in your hands. You know where this creature is hidden. Of course, and who hide them. Rondo straightened, interested.
Tell me. It is the Canehorn family. The Canehorn family?
His brow wrinkled.
That brute. It is unthinkable that his schemings extend beyond marching an army outside your door. To hear this makes me worry what else he had slipped by me all these years with that oafish front. We are already in the process of smoothing out that particular bump hindering your path. You mustn't worry about it. But now it is my turn to question you.
Rondo looked down his nose, but otherwise seemed to accept the question.
I did not appreciate the slaughter of my spies in Panes. I will not permit any prying eyes, friend or foe, though at the time I was unaware they were yours. Regardless, I am aware you are not in the possession of the pendant's other half,
Agathon said with a smirk, and nourished himself on the subtle, surprised and irritated face Rondo gave him.
What use is all this if you cannot uphold your end of the bargain? That is none of your concern. But if it is the king's half of the pendant you are worried about, it could be in my possession any time I wished.
Salvi stared at the ceiling, spread flat on her back. It was dark. The stones were cold against her bare scales. Her clothes and possessions had been stripped from her, leaving her naked, except for the makeshift loincloth wrapped around her waist. The gods had given it to her not so much to preserve her dignity, of which she had none, but instead to spare them the sight. But Salvi didn't know that. If she had, likely she would have stripped them right off immediately, just to taunt them. But such as it was, she appreciated the way they kept a cold stone from sapping all the heat from her bottom. There was a small window at the top of the cell, though it was much too small for even her to fit through. She had already tried, no matter that the warden was staring right at her the whole time with a bemused look on his face. After attempting to shove her face through the bars and reaching past to pick at a lock with her fingernails, she had officially run out of escape plans. The ceiling wasn't very interesting. She turned on her side. Someone, or several someones, had carved something into the stone walls that she could not read, but that did not stop her from trying. It kept her occupied for at least 5 minutes. She thought about screaming again. She had realized it wasn't getting anywhere after the first 20 minutes. But the next 2 hours had been purely for spite and schadenfreude. But she was tired and her throat hurt. She rolled onto her other side and stared at the warden. He was slumped in his chair, tongue lolling. She was pretty sure he only pretended to sleep, considering the way he continued to flinch every time her screech had broken pitches higher than a countertenor with their testicles in a vise. But he had been going at it so long, she was beginning to doubt herself. She flopped onto her stomach and stared at the floor. Bugs had crawled there before. Ants, centipedes, even a lizard, but she had already eaten all of them. She tried to count the stones, but couldn't get higher than 7 before giving up. She sighed and set her bony, reptilian cheeks against the stone, bored. Her eyes swiveled to look at the floor, for no reason in particular, blurry in the vision from its proximity. She picked and scratched at a mortar between the joints. To her surprise, it cracked and flaked away. She scratched harder and harder as even more chunks flaked away from the stone. She managed to make it halfway around the stone before the mortar began to shrug off her nails. She stood up, suddenly excited, and slipped her fingers into the crack. Her back bent, quivering in an arc as she strained. Her neck muscles bulged, and her lips peeled as her eyes rolled into her skull. There was no question that a hidden passage lay hidden beneath the stone. It felt like her arms would pop from their sockets. When the stone gave, it sent her tumbling backwards. She stood up, dashed around, and stared beneath the stone. Her disappointment was immeasurable. It was unsurprising that all that lay beneath was dirt, but it was surprising to her. Undaunted, mostly due to boredom, she began scratching at the dirt, but found it barely covering rough bedrock. There wasn't much to do after that, so she decided to try and pry off the stone the rest of the way, in hopes of perhaps throwing it at a guard, despite the fact it weighed more than her body and would barely fit through the bars sideways. It wouldn't budge any further, and only after the fact did she decide throwing rocks at the warden probably wouldn't have been a good idea anyway. And with that, she was officially out of ideas. She sat down, crossed her arms, and flopped onto her back once again. She closed her eyes and came up with one last idea. Maybe if she pretended to be asleep like the guard was, maybe he would open her cage, thinking she couldn't escape. It didn't make much sense, but it made sense to her. She closed her eyes and waited, adding in her own rhythmic breathing and whistling breath for extra flair. Up and down her chest rose and fell. Time stretched into eternity. Her arms and legs were stiff, begging to move, but she couldn't. She had to stay still. She remained in that pose for what felt like an hour, but was really closer to 10 minutes. She gave up mimicking the breaths and was about to throw out the whole idea when she heard footsteps. Did the warden get up? She laid there, motionless, as the footsteps echoed faintly on the stones. Tap, tap, tap. They grew closer and stopped. Her heart ran fast. She heard the jiggle of metal, heard it slide into the latch and click. Her breath stopped in that instant. Her muscles coiled like springs, but not yet. The metal gate squeaked open, slowly, and then came 1, 2 steps more, and Salvi sprang to her feet and rushed for the door, stopped short and froze for a heartbeat that seemed eternity. It was not the warden. Hooded black, it melded with the darkness, all except the gleam of the blade, silvery in the moonlight. The figure rushed forward. Salvi made a desperate dash to the side, but it moved with such speed she would certainly be caught. Another heartbeat passed, as her flesh cringed in anticipation of the bite of steel. But then came the next heartbeat. The surging intruder surged right past. His foot snagged on the upturned stone that pitched him forward like a bull charging off a cliff. He grunted, fell hands first onto the stones, and sprang back up. But Salvi had wasted no time. She ran out the gate and slammed it behind her, latching it just in time. The intruder slammed against the gate with a terrible crash and thrust his hands through the bars. Salvi started and yanked the key from the lock, just as the probing hands groped at the block of iron that was the latching mechanism. She swayed back as it suddenly groped at her, and narrowly managed to dodge the knife that whizzed by her head. Then 2 more sailed past in quick succession. She scrambled around the room like a roach in daylight, and tripped over the body of the motionless warden, grabbing his share on the way down. 3 more blades thunked into the wood. Then they stopped. She breathed hard. She peeked out from the share and ducked behind as another projectile searched for her vitals. The next spat of stillness seemed genuine, and after a long time she pushed a share of herself and stood up, staring at a baleful man in the cage in utter awe. Then it hit her. He was in there, and she was out here. She burst into laughter, pointing and jeering at the would-be assassin, dancing and smacking her behind as she flashed between several obscene gestures, only half of which humans would understand. Her spiteful reverie was cut short when a shoe struck her across the temple. She fell over, rubbed her head, and glared at the man in the cage. Let him rot in there for all she cared. She almost left, but managed to remember something important. She searched through the warden's desk, sending its content arching through the air to land behind her, like a digging dog, until she found her clothes, jewelry, and beautiful pendant. She felt no shame as she changed in front of the caged man. She smiled. She felt right again. She did not mind being naked, but was beginning to feel more and more comfortable in these clothes. She made her way to the door.
Wait!
She turned.
Let me out! Please!
No!
Salvi left. She walked down the shadowy corridors, and after passing the same potted plant 4 times, suddenly realized she had no idea where she was going. Far more concerning was the sound of armored feet approaching from several directions at once. She had become all too familiar with that sound. Why were there so many humans out to get her? She hadn't done anything wrong, yet. She ran up the stairs. It was the only direction she couldn't hear marching feet, and appeared into another long corridor. It seemed to stretch on forever in the darkness, with no doors or decorations along the way. She followed its length, and it eventually turned slightly, perhaps a 30-degree angle, before continuing in another straight line. There were stairs there, but she knew at least that she wanted to be going down, not up. She walked down that corridor too, turned a corner and paused, as she came face to face with an enormous, unarmed man. They stared at each other, blank-faced. It took 2 good seconds before their brains could process it. The man shouted. Salvi bolted the other way, pumping her arms as if she were trying to pound in 2 stakes with her fists, while the man gave chase. It was like he was breathing down her neck, and his shouts were bringing more guards her way. Fingers brushed her tail, once, then twice, then grabbed on. She squeaked, lurching forwards in shock. Her tail slipped free. She felt like screaming, and decided that was just what she would do, in the hopes that it would motivate her legs to run faster. Space began to spread between them as she redoubled her pace and soon reached the end of the hall. She slipped away, skidding to a stop before scrambling up the stairs she had just passed. The man bellowed something from below and sounded like a crate falling down a cliff as he clambered hotly behind. The stairs spiraled around and around. Reaching the top, her searching hands found some form of wooden furniture she had not time to identify, and threw it behind her, striking the man with a crash. He stumbled, but did not fall. She threw open the door at the top and slammed it shut behind her. The room was filled with dust, books, and assorted instruments so specific they were used perhaps once a year. She tried to block the door, but found herself too weak to move anything of substantial weight. She looked around in the heart-pounding moments at the solid walls and realized she was trapped. She ran to the window, stuck her head out, and marveled at 100-foot drop. The city stretched out below, black and dead in the pre-dawn light. She found herself atop a tower set inside the inner wall of the city. She glanced back at the door, then back out the window. The man broke into the room, fuming like a stovepipe, as he looked around the room with hands cocked and ready to strangle anything that moved. He was shocked to find it utterly empty. He stomped from chair to linen-draped cabinets, searching inside and underneath anything he could find to look for the little wretch. He found nothing.
Did that bugger spread wings and fly?
He moved to the window and looked down, expecting to see a kobold shape splat mark on the cobbles below, and instead met eyes with the creature. They shared another awkward glance. Salvi stared at a man who was a hair over 50 feet away now. Her claws dug into the mortar joints like it was, well, a matter of life and death. The man shouted something again. She hurried down as fast as she could without slipping and dying. She stared at the ground, growing ever closer. An enormous gust of wind threatened to knock her off, and she watched as a cabinet exploded into splinters on the stones below. She stared up to see the man tipping another piece out the window. Her heart thumped against her ribcage. She couldn't go any faster. She couldn't go any faster. But she needed to get to the bottom. Hand to foot, hand to foot. She climbed down the stones, gasping in terror, as each rush and subsequent crash threatened to knock her off from the fear alone. She tried not to look up. It wasn't as if she could dodge it anyway. So she focused on the ground, growing closer and closer. She was almost there. Something crashed into her head. Colors exploded into her vision. Her claws slipped from the stone as she plummeted backwards like an electrocuted insect. She hit hard. Her body was motionless. She groaned. The fall drove dozens of splinters between her scales. To the man and Salvis' surprise, she moved. Her foreign arms tested motions like an infant from the womb. She flopped over and crawled before she could limp into the comfortable embrace of the shadows. Guards spilled into the streets. She ducked into an alley, fighting the pain as she forced herself to move. Tybalt sat with his head in his hands. Motes of dust spun in the shafts of orange light, pouring in from the small window above the cell, like stars in the firmament. It bathed the corpse in the cage in an almost otherworldly light. He felt like he was part of some black comedy. The warden sat beside. His face sagged with the weight of guilt and failure, so heavy it seemed to add another 10 years to his face.
How could you let this happen?
Tybalt whispered. He had let his hopes rise too high, and they dropped like lead. He had known it had gone wrong the moment he had entered. The way the guards were buzzing around the gate, encircling the compound behind the inner walls. He knew it all too well. But the reality of it hadn't quite hit until he had stepped inside and let his eyes fall upon the corpse. Tybalt tightened his fists.
The kobold is gone. The pendant is gone. How could you think this puny cage was enough to restrain them? They should have been manacled. Guards at every door. Everything. With all due respect, sir,
the warden sighed.
How could we possibly have known? The letter contained nothing of this. How were we to know the creature was so dangerous?
The man was right. How Tybalt wished he wasn't, but he was right. He wished he could explode at the man, let out all his pent-up rage and frustration. But it wouldn't change anything. So forced it inside and let a feeling squirm around his guts.
Don't know how they did it,
the warden mused.
Blast me! I don't know how they did it. One moment I was there that I wasn't. It was like blinking. 1 second later I was up. The sun was shining through that window. That corpse was in the cell. Burn me. Is it magic? It's not magic. They pulled the same trick at Castle Farisles. I truly don't understand. Who is in the cage? It's no one I've met, and their skin is unlike any in these parts. That's what I like to know myself.
Tybalt walked ahead and wrapped his hands around the bars and peered at the corpse inside. He had an idea who it was. He knew they were after the pendant, and suspected if he asked his scouts, they would identify him as the one who had gotten away from them some days ago. But this... It threw his whole understanding into chaos. Why was he in there when the kobold had escaped? Knives littered the floor. There had been a struggle. Was this man sent to rescue them, only to be betrayed at the last moment? Or had they been enemies from the start?
What happened after it escaped? The cook of all people found them wandering the corridors. They fled up the north tower and climbed down the whole way. The cook claimed he injured it with some furniture he threw out the window. Injured? Yes, but not enough to stop them from fleeing in any case. But they will not escape the city. The captain of the guard has already secured the gate, and every guard in the city is on the walls or in the streets looking for them. Yes.
He wished it were true, but if he knew that kobold, if it hadn't already escaped, it remained only to taunt them before vanishing like a puff of smoke. Then he would be on the road again.
Watch it! Sorry.
Braum mumbled. The whole company marched to meet Tybalt inside the city walls of Gribbuck. That was the third time mindlessly bumping into someone. His mind kept drifting. He didn't know what to think. There was no doubt about it. Salvi was the kobold they were looking for. But how? She was so nice and defenseless.
Out of the way!
Braum leaped out of the way of an approaching wagon. He spat out the dust as the driver's curses faded out into the distance. Well, he decided, if anything could snap him out of it, That would. He stood, slapped himself off, and stepped back in line, trying to put his mind to other things.